What's going on, Roto Grinders? Dean here. That would be Dean 7904 if you want to get all technical on me. It is 7:30 on the East Coast, 4:30 on the West Coast on a Saturday night. Of course, that means it's time for the NFL DFS Mailbag Show, Roto Grinders and Daily Roto combined. Good times. Back with us. I'm surprised, Dink. Drew Dinkbeast Dinkmeyer. I'm shocked. I thought you were going to come down with a late scratch, flu-like symptoms or something like that. You are a gamer because your Cubbies are playing tonight in about a half hour or so. Not that I didn't need to tell you this. And you're going to power on through the show. I feel like your analysis is going to kind of dip around 8:05 or so.
Yeah, I feel like I got a good peak 30 minutes in me, and then my stamina might not be as great as it usually is.
Welcome to the show. Tell us what's going on over at Daily Roto this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Over at Daily Roto, we've got tons of good NFL premium and free content. You know, we've got picks articles, strategy articles, but on the premium side, we've also got our projections. And the really cool thing we added this year was customizable projections. So you can take all of our defaults on target market shares, carry market shares, touchdown market shares, and you can adjust them and kind of create your own projections if you'd like. You can use our defaults if you'd like, but it's a cool tool to play around with. And I like to use it for testing upside in certain situations. So if I'm wrong on this player and instead of getting a 20% market share of targets, they get 28%, what would their projection look like? I think it's a real cool tool to help build GPP lineups along with creating your own custom projections.
Joining the show for the very first time, I'm not really sure how you got roped into it, Cards. Justin Van Zoot, Nesteel Cardinals 84. Cards, how's the Saturday night treating you?
Well, Drew said that I probably requested this show just to needle him a little bit about the Cubs game starting in the middle of the show. But happy to be on, and it's fun to answer some of these questions. We got a few good ones for tonight, and some interesting stuff on week 6 along the way. So it should be fun.
You might be rounding up a little bit. There's a couple good ones, but it was hard to select like 5 or 6. I said it before the show. I'm going to lecture the chat again. You guys are letting me down. You guys are disappointing me. You can do better than this. In the forums every single week. Friday night, it's usually posted. You can ask a question. If we select your question, you win yourself some sweet swag. There's only like 15 or 20 questions in there. We picked 5 or so. And kind of, again, we even had the crowdsource to get the 5th question. By the way, Cards, I saw a tweet. You're talking about the Cubbies. You said your neighbor outside has a brand new large blue W flag that's never been professed to Cubs fans as far as his allegiance. You're calling him a fraud. Are you saying, is this a subtle way of saying the Cardinals are the best fans in the world and the Cubs don't?
No, not at all. It's just, he had never said anything about baseball really before, or even – I couldn't have even told you if he was a baseball fan, but he's out there ready to fly the W flag if the Cubs win tonight. He's going to be out next door to me, I'm sure, on a big flagpole, and I'm not really sure how to feel about it. So, I can't give him too much because he's like, I don't know, he's probably 80 years old. So, I maybe he's been a Cub fan his whole life, and
this might be his first opportunity, Justin.
Yes, and I don't want to take that away from him, but it was a nice shiny W flag, and we'll see. He's not flying it yet, so he's not putting a bad karma on him to get it up there before the game tonight, at least.
I feel like I might be bearing the lead. The surprise here is that you have neighbors. I thought you were like in the middle of like a cornfield or so. No, I guess not.
There is a cornfield across the street, but I am in a subdivision, so we do have humanity around us.
So if I ask you for like an ear of corn, you can just come up with like 3 minutes tops.
Believe it or not, there are like restaurants within 5 minutes of my house. It is possible for me to sustain a living.
I like to live in my own world and kind of pretend that. All right, let's move on. Let's hit up the questions. And like we said, we keep talking about when we ask for the questions, we want them to be broad, something we can kind of talk about in general, and then just kind of like work onto the slate. Don't necessarily say, hey, do you like this guy or that guy? We're probably not going to select that. With that, this question is going to kind of bleed into something else, so I selected it. First question is from Narniak. With FanDuel and DK making recent similar changes, is there any possibility of the two possibly merging? And also, he's kind of asking about the potential of rake going up. Now, true, I don't really have a lot to say as far as a merger. I don't know anything. Nobody talks to me. Nobody's told me anything's happening. I don't really want to prospect on it necessarily, but I do think it, the big news, of course, on DK is the late swap went out. And I feel like I know it's definitely something you want to talk about because I saw your Twitter machine lighting up this weekend. What are your thoughts as far as late swap? And if you want to say anything about a potential merger, by all means, go for it.
Yeah. So the rumors about a merger have been around for, over a year now. And I think when there's that much smoke, there's probably some fire to the discussions. And I do think from a player's perspective, a merger would ultimately be worse for the players. I think it gives, creating any sort of monopoly as a customer is usually a bad thing. They have total pricing power over you with control on site fees and different things like that. And then also, I just think it's better in general to have more options, more different places to play, more unique scoring structures or unique pricing structures that allow you to maybe create different types of lineups. So I think for me personally, I'm rooting against a merger. I don't know on the probability of whether it would happen or not, but certainly it's been talked about for quite a while. And I think the late swap issue kind of bleeds into that a little bit for me, where I liked having the different options to play on FanDuel or DraftKings and sort of have your choice of whether you want to actively use late swap or whether you want to play on a site that doesn't allow it. And so I'm disappointed in DraftKings decisions. I'm especially disappointed that it's not consistent across the board. I think if you're going to change it in one sport, you should be changing it across all sports. It doesn't, to me, it comes off as more of, well, the NBA is a very unique animal because there's so much news and so many different things, and the people who are paying attention the most have the biggest advantage, that we want to kind of take that away. And that, to me, is just very disappointing from a consumer perspective, because I just prefer consistency. If I'm going to play on a site, I like to understand that the framework of the site is consistent across all the sports. And I think taking away late swap for just one sport really, really hurts that.
What are your thoughts, Cards?
Yeah, I wasn't a big fan at first. I mean, I kind of echo most of what Drew said on all that. And as a person who you try to get every edge you can, when you play this game for a long time, and that was certainly an avenue where you could gain an edge on DraftKings. So from that perspective, I didn't like it. As a parent, I don't mind it, just because sometimes I would miss a thing occasionally, but the big key for me, or if I had to take a side on it, I would prefer to have the options, on nights where we had a lot of stuff going on. I probably wouldn't play as much on a late swap site, but that's also part of the reason maybe why DK made that change. So it's tough. I understand where they're coming from, but I like the fact that the two major sites used to be a little bit different in that regard. And now we don't have that, at least for NBA. As far as the merger goes, there's probably going to be discussions. To me, the big hurdle would be the differences in sports. If you're going to keep operating them as two sites, maybe, but there'd have to be some way where they could agree, because DraftKings offers golf and NASCAR and MMA and other sports that FanDuel hasn't really wanted to touch, whether for legal reasons or other reasons. To me, that would be the biggest hurdle, just that DK has a little bit of a different philosophy on that. But inevitably, in an industry when the growth stage is eventually going to slow down, and we're probably already there a little bit now, there's probably going to be some rumblings at some point.
Yeah, I basically agree with both you guys, actually, as far as that. MPE, multi-position eligibility, Dink, do we like that? At least is that kind of a compromise? At least we're getting that back?
Yeah, it's certainly helpful. I think one of the challenges, if you're not going to have MPE, my biggest complaint was then you really need to be on top of the positional changes, and you almost have to be rotating them on a daily basis with how teams are adjusting to injuries and different things like that. Because the challenge with NBA is it's really a positionless sport. Players nowadays, you'll see some minutes during a game where like LeBron James is playing center. You'll see some where he's playing power forward. You'll see some where he's playing small forward. So segregating players into individual positions seemed very limiting. So I was happy to see MPE back. But late swap was a real big hit for me personally. I know, providing content and providing alerts and different things that we do at Daily Roto for our subscribers, oftentimes I would provide the alerts and I'd adjust my FanDuel lineups, and then I'd use that time from 7 to 7:25 or so to adjust my DraftKings lineups, and now I don't have that. So I also think for a lot of people, and I'm not sure enough people are really talking about this, but I think for those that use some sort of automated processes to make your lineups, I think there's a big advantage, because you have inherently less time than you may have had to adjust before. Because a lot of times the news that comes out right before 7 is not impacting the 7 o'clock games, it's impacting the 7:30 games. And so before, you'd at least on DraftKings have time to kind of react to that with that extra 20 minutes, and now losing it. So I'm happy to have MPE. I think that is a nice small compromise, but losing late swap for me was really frustrating.
I know that part really probably spoke to you, Dean, because I know you were a proponent of set your DraftKings lineups and don't play anybody in the 7 o'clock games and go back and change them later.
Yeah, well, yeah. Like I have a very special example, just like specific situations like Dink does. Like I'm usually doing the show from 5:30 to 6:30, kind of about a half hour or so, adjust all the late news, and I would tend to my FanDuel lineups first because you got to lock those in. Which, by the way, we bumped to 7:05 as far as a lock time.
Yeah,
no game ever started before 7:05. It just doesn't happen. But that's a whole other conversation. Those extra 5 minutes are very important. They would be precious for me. But yeah, what I would do is like say there's 2 or 3 7:00 games. I'm like, who do I actually need these games? Do I need anybody? Or if it's a push, it's like, okay, I'll backload it and I'll take the random guy later that's kind of even and buy myself an extra hour's worth of information and kind of adjust if the dominoes start to fall. But I guess I'm going to have to adjust. I've heard some people suggest that this is an advantage to people going after Qs because you're going to be more apt to guys that enter a ton of lineups that go after Qs, basically suggesting that if you have 1 or 2, maybe 3 lineups, you're not going to play somebody that's questionable that's playing on the West Coast. But if you're firing out 50 lineups or so, maybe you are. Is that a thing, Cards? Because I don't really think that's a huge advantage necessarily.
No, I think a lot of people that are firing multiple lineups, I mean, you try to center that around a core. If you're just throwing one-off plays here, there, and everywhere just because somebody's questionable or out, that doesn't necessarily seem like it would increase your edge. If anything, that would be a long-term losing proposition unless you just happen to hit the right combination one night. So I don't really think that speaks to what multi-entry people are generally trying to do on a nightly basis. So I don't really buy into that.
Dick, if there's a merger, do you think that rake might even go up further?
I think it would be tough for it to go much further from here. I hope it wouldn't, but 15% is very, very high. And a lot of the GPPs now are right around or just below 15% on both sites. So I'm really hopeful that if there was a merger, it couldn't get too much further up from here just by kind of the way math works. Like you can't, once you get so high, you're just going to start losing customers on the whole because you're going to work through the system quicker. So I don't think it could get too much higher, but I think any hopes of it getting lower would certainly be hurt by a merger.
Cards, you want to pretend to be a lawyer for a second? Is it possible that it would be like a monopoly? We're kind of sort of at a duopoly right now, I guess, 94. What is the percent as far as DK and FanDuel as far as market share? It's in the 90s as far as percentage, correct?
In total, sure, yeah. I mean, almost every player that's, even if you're playing on the smaller sites, you're playing there too, so.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's a whole other conversation again. I don't want to speculate, but that's probably one more hurdle they might have to have as far as the merger, a potential merger if it happens. And I think all of us kind of agree it's best for players if they do not merge. And I like the idea to have give me the option. And the fact this option closed kind of troubles me. And again, hopefully that rate does stay down. Moving on, next question from MPORRECA 11, M Peressa 11. I apologize if I butchered your name. Dink, do you consider DK's NFL pricing algorithm to be sharper than FanDuel, as it seems to be with baseball? And if so, is it useful to compare pricing of players on each site when looking for value? Now, I feel like I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like you roll out more than one cash lineup. And what I do is I just look for the values. I like a certain group of players, and I'm like, well, I'll get this guy on this site where he's cheaper, and that guy on that site where he's cheaper, and just you kind of have a pool of players, and if they all do well, it's going to be a good week for you. Is that kind of like your approach when it comes to pricing on FanDuel and DK?
For sure. And it's funny the way the question was phrased. It's almost like if you think one is sharper, then you should take advantage of the different prices. But I think they're independent. I happen to think that both sites have done a really nice job at getting sharper with pricing over the course of the last 12 months. I certainly think DraftKings was leading that charge. I thought they were a little sharper early on with some of the pricing. But right now, I actually think both of the sites are pretty similar in terms of the way that they're approaching prices. So I think it just comes down to some individual players happen to be cheaper on one site than the other. And I don't think it has anything necessarily to do with a specific price algorithm being sharper or not as sharp. It's just some differences. But I do think those differences are things that you should be taking advantage of if you're a cash game player and you want to get exposure to somebody. Like this week, for example, if you want to get exposure to DeMarco Murray, he's in a really good spot. Home favorite. You never see Tennessee with an implied total approaching 25 points or greater. He's much friendlier priced on DraftKings than he is on FanDuel relative to the other running backs at his position. So if you're going to get DeMarco Murray exposure and you like DeMarco Murray, it's probably better to do it on DraftKings than it is on FanDuel. And I take that approach with all the player pool that I put together that I really like. I try to get more of my exposure to those guys on the sites that are more affordably priced.
The other thing is, like if you look at defenses, how condensed they are in FanDuel, and if you look on DK, let's scroll up as far as this week. Most expensive defenses are the Bills at 3.7, and DK, we're looking at the Saints at 2K. You're not going to roster the Saints at 2K, but the Bears at 2.3, I guess are worth a shot, sure. I mean, you're saving so much money. It's almost twice as much to pay up for the Bills. Is that something you look at as well? And also tight end, too. The tight end discrepancy is another big thing to consider from site to site. How about yourself, Cards? How do you handle that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. We talked about the defense pricing on SiriusXM the other day. So it's just, you got to take advantage of whatever the sites are giving you. So regardless of whether one site is sharper than the other or not, if you see a big difference, you can take advantage of that no matter which of the sites it is, kind of like what Drew said. And I think for the most part that both sites have done a pretty good job this year. Outside of DraftKings kind of fell asleep one week. I forget which week it was, but the week that Terrell Pryor was really cheap and had the big game the week before, it seemed like the DraftKings pricing was pretty soft that week. But other than that, it's been pretty good. I mean, there's not been a ton of weeks where, one guy's been 50, 60% owned across the board because of pricing, maybe because of matchup. But but it's always something you got to look at as you're building your lineups. If you're playing three sites and there's one guy that's significantly more affordable on one site and you like him, I mean, that's the site you probably want to play him with the most exposure. So it's definitely something where you can gain an advantage over the people that aren't looking at it. It might be slight, but in this day and age, you're looking for every edge you can get. So definitely something to look at.
Cards, Drew gave us an example as far as a player this week. Is there anybody that kind of like there's a big discrepancy from FanDuel to DK and you're going to kind of load up on one spot and kind of fade in the other spot?
Yeah, there's not really that much. I mean, I will probably go cheaper on my defense on DraftKings this week simply because I think, with the Vikings on a bye, with the Cardinals playing on Monday night, the Broncos played on Thursday, it's somewhat of a crapshoot at defense this week. Maybe there's one or two teams you really feel comfortable with, but on FanDuel, since the defensive pricing is so narrow between the top and the bottom, I'll probably go for my top projected point-scoring defenses over there, and I'll probably go cheap on DraftKings simply because I think it might come down to this week, as it usually does, but who's going to be that team that gets that defensive touchdown? Who's going to be the team that gets the special teams touchdown? It's not fun to click the button on some of these lower-end teams, but a team like Houston that's under 3K on DraftKings, or even if you want to be ambitious with a team like the Bears, I don't necessarily think that's a bad strategy because there really isn't a standout defense this week.
And you make a good point because, like you said, well, as far as I can tell, the consensus is the Bills, right? Are you on board with that, Dink? As far as if salary wasn't a thing, the Bills are the best defense?
I think we have a bunch of defenses that are projected really tightly. So we don't have a consensus. Like last week, we thought it was very clear that Minnesota was the number one defense. This week, we think there's probably like a handful: Tennessee, Buffalo. We actually have the Bears rated pretty high, and it's basically that Blake Bortles is just a fantasy fun fest for defenses. Whether he's scoring points or not, he's almost always giving up sacks and giving up turnovers. Houston is another defense. Same thing with Andrew Luck. He puts points on the board. But a lot of people have to remember that the difference between 14 and 34 points is just 2 points, 2 actual fantasy points, the equivalent of 1 turnover. So I think these guys that take sacks and have heavy pass volumes are always good guys to target. So we've got a bunch of defenses ranked closely. The Bills are in that group of, I'd say, a group of 4 or 5 that we have as kind of all the top.
Yeah, the Colts by 3 sacks more than everybody else have got more sacks in the entire league. 20, I believe. The 17 is the next team up there. And Houston, I know they lost Watt, and people want to run away from that, but they can still get pressure on the quarterback. And what's a fair number, Dink? 3.5 as far as sacks? 2.5? I don't want to say 3 because.
Yeah, I would say 3.5 would probably, the number would probably be 3, but I'd say 3.5 would be closer than 2.5. So I'd say a fair number would probably be 3 juiced on the over.
Yeah, and Cards, I think if we took a survey, who's your second favorite defense? Like you can ask 10 different people and get 8 different answers.
Maybe get 10 different answers. Who knows? Yeah, it's a wild week with the way the schedule is broken with buys and the Thursday and Monday games. And, to that point about Andrew Luck, he's been sacked 11 times the last 2 games. So that line is just – it's in shambles. And when your team has to score a bunch of points because your defense isn't any good, he's just been taking a pounding back there. And, you kind of wonder if that's going to take its toll as the season goes on.
So in seasons past, I've kind of noticed FanDuel, like the salaries kind of like creep up and creep up and creep up. You know, if you have a big week, you go up $500. Another big week, you go up $500. If you do nothing, you have a bad week, you go down like $100. Have you noticed this thing? Like this is the thing in the past where like the reward for having a good game was more than the penalty for having a bad game. I feel like that's subdued a little bit this year, but is that something that you've been like cautious of or aware of, or is that my own imagination?
No, I think that's pretty much always been the case for every site outside of Draft Street, which rest in peace. I love you all at Draft Street. But Draft Street was probably the one site that actually aggressively decreased pricing based on recent poor performance. And it led to a value investor's dream for someone like me that likes to really pick on value. The other sites, I agree with you 100%, Dean. I think they're more aggressive to raise prices than they are to drop prices. And that can make it a little bit tough. And I think that's kind of what we've hit on DraftKings this week, where I feel like the first 5 weeks, the pricing as a whole was pretty soft. And I feel like this is the first week where I feel like, okay, this is a little bit tighter. And this is kind of where we ended last season as well, where most of the season for the NFL last year on DraftKings, I thought pricing was very soft. And then towards the end, I thought it tightened up a little bit. And I think that's just the bulk of a lot of upward price adjustments and not as many downward price adjustments.
I'm getting a flashback. Remember, Draft Street, of course, had a $100,000 salary, and remember, like the random point guard that was going to get 30 minutes or so a run at like $3 or $4K. That was beautiful, wasn't it?
Yeah. Ray McCallum was one that I had a great night with old Draft Sheet.
Oh boy,
talking about Ray McCallum, there was that night that Steph Curry that he was like priced at like 1.4K, like below the minimum. There were some fun things that Draft Street did with their pricing with how dynamic it was. And I like that. I think the pricing algorithms now are a little bit less based on recent performance and a little bit more based on ownership and matchup and different things like that. So I think it's a little bit more complicated and complex, the algorithms now, than they were back then.
All right, let's head back to the mailbag. This is going to kind of get us digging in as far as the slate this week. Cards is the best way to differentiate yourself in tournaments to pay down a quarterback and running back and pay up a tight end, wide receiver. If you've listened to any touts, if you run anything this week, or if you've done your own research, you probably come up with the same conclusion. It is running back week, and there's so many elite running backs. And there's like, running back 4, 5, 6, and 7. If it was any other week, they would kind of jump off the page. But because 1, 2, and 3 look so good, and we'll talk about that in a second. But is that something you're doing, Cards? I know you're a GPP player. Are you forcing yourself to intentionally say, you know what, I'm just going to fade these top running backs? I know they're in great spots, and maybe just bang up for Antonio Brown, which I don't think many people are going to do. What are your thoughts as far as tackling this slate and how to be different?
That's definitely the way to be different this week. I don't think there's really any question about it. To me, and it's rare that I'm in this situation in this day and age of football, but I will probably run a running back in a lot of my flex positions on DraftKings this week, and I haven't done that, a ton this year. But there's so many of those high-end running backs that are in great spots. To me, one way to differentiate yourself would be to try to get 3 of them in there. And I've worked with that on a few different lineups. If you try to play Le'Veon Bell and McCoy and Murray, or, maybe a third guy that's
– Is that different? I don't think that's different.
All 3 of them together?
And I'm not different.
Fair enough. But the problem with all right, so let's go back to the question. It's definitely different to go cheap at running back and expensive at wide receiver because – you give me a running back under 5,000 on DraftKings that you feel totally comfortable rolling out there this week. And I think you're going to be lying to me if you give me an answer that you're 100% convinced on. So in tournaments, I think it's a good idea because your lineup is almost guaranteed to be different than most of the field. Obviously, other people will take the same strategy, but it's not going to be a large percentage of the field. And, if you do that, you can get a pathway to Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham or, AJ Green or whoever you want to use on the high end at wide receiver this week, because it kind of correlates outside of Antonio Brown. A lot of those top end receivers aren't in the best matchups on the planet. It's not like all of them have bad matchups, but it's not, cakewalk matchups outside of Antonio Brown, who's 9,700 on FanDuel and 10K on DraftKings. So I don't necessarily think going cheap at quarterback is super different. I think there are enough value quarterbacks to where people will get drawn to that, especially if they're trying to spend up at running back. But definitely going low on the running back and high on the wide receiver this week is a way to differentiate your GPP lineups. as far as if I'm going to do it, I mean, I might mix and match because I don't want to completely fade these high-end running backs this week. There's so many good spots, and it's hard to see all of them, busting. Somebody's going to have a huge game there.
I think it's almost different to play guys like Lamar Miller and Kristen Michael, who are perfectly fine. But again, the fact that DeMarco Murray and McCoy and Bell are so well positioned, they're going to be they're going to have a lower percentage as far as ownership than they probably should. So Dick, we kind of know that's a way to be different, but like, do you have to be different? And like, maybe you can just be different with the cheapies that we add with a guy like Le'Veon Bell, or the cheapies we have with a guy like Murray and McCoy. How do you tackle this? I know you have kind of a cash game brain, and you think similarly to me along those lines. You don't get too goofy. You won the Millie Maker with basically a chalk lineup with the exception of one guy. So, like, what is your thought process? Are you a little conflicted here this week?
Yeah, so I think there's three ways you can approach tournaments this week. I think the first way that you can do it is exactly the way the question was asked, which is I think you can pay down at quarterback and running back, go up at wide receiver and tight end, and naturally you're going to have a very different constructed lineup than everyone else. The challenge with that is finding enough players that you feel comfortable doing that with. I have like one guy on DraftKings I really like as a cheap running back for tournaments. I think James White is a really good play at 3.9. But there's not a lot. There's not a lot of options down there that you can feel comfortable with. So I think that's one way you can do it. Another way that you can do it is sort of what you talked about, Dean, which is building similarly price-structured lineups, but choosing different players at those price points. So choosing a guy like Lamar Miller instead of LaShawn McCoy. Choosing a guy like maybe a Michael Thomas over a Cam Meredith. Or different things like that, where you can get similar price points, but guys that may get overlooked simply because the guys around them are perceived as stronger plays. And then I think the third way that you can try to go about it is trying to be somewhat chalky and play within those ranges, but take a shot on one position. So instead of going super cheap on both running back positions, maybe use one cheap running back and pay up at one wide receiver spot. And then within that strategy, I think the best way to do it is instead of going all the way up to like one Antonio Brown is get two mid-tier guys, like maybe a Doug Baldwin and, a Marvin Jones, like two guys like that instead. I think those are the ways to create a little bit more upside in your lineup, because the thing about running back weeks is they naturally, if the running backs are going to go off, they naturally have a lower ceiling relative to the wide receivers, because when they go off, they're not getting a catch typically. They're not getting a point for every time that they touch the ball, like a wide receiver does with the PPR. So usually when those weeks that they are heavy scoring on the running back side of the spectrum, the overall scoring is a little bit lower, which means you don't need to push the bar quite as high. And generally, those high-end wide receivers or the mid-high wide receivers tend to have the highest upside. So squeezing a few of those in, along with maybe one cheap running back, I think is a great way to go in GPPs this week.
I always stress this. I think the ownership percentage conversation is very important to have. It's worth having. It's worth acknowledging. It's worth understanding. But it's gone too far. Like, some people are. When there was a question in the mailbag that basically kind of asked, like, at what point, what percentage do you just like don't play players because the ownership percentage is going to be too high? Because there's a reason why the ownership percentage will be that high. And the other part of it is, if you can just find that one guy that's 4% owned, your lineup is different than 96% of the field. Not even talking about everybody else. Of course, that one guy is, that much more important than everybody else. But it's one of those conversations. It's just gone too far. And it's, again, understand the ownership percentages, but don't. I think it lets people dictate their decisions a little bit too much. Dan Cards asked a question: what guy is under 5K? So you said basically James White. He's 4.1K. Does that mean? But let's round up just for the sake of the conversation. Jamal Charles. He says he's ready. Narrative Street says he wants the training wheels off, but I'm not playing him. Are you?
Yeah, I'm not going to have a lot of exposure to Jamal Charles. I think if I'm going to go KC running back, I think Spencer Ware is the better play, simply because I don't see a scenario where one of the two running backs runs away with the percentage of touches. But I do think there's a scenario where Ware has a slight advantage on those touches, and Ware is also the primary goal line option, simply because they sort of flirted with that idea in the preseason when they were talking about bringing Jamal back, that he might not be the goal line guy anyway. So with running backs, the upside is always in the touchdowns. In that case, I lean towards Ware as a better play than Jamal Charles. But both of those guys for me are more sprinkles than they are plays that I'm really, really interested in. The other cheap guys below 5,000 that I'm looking at some of our projections now. A guy that disappointed a lot of people last week in that same game, I think DeAndre Washington is pretty interesting. Some of the ownership's going to fade away after he was disappointing last week because, hey, he didn't get the goal line touchdown. That went to Olawale. But DeAndre Washington had 2 carries inside the 3-yard line. He played more snaps than Jalen Richard, even though Jalen Richard was more effective and he got the same amount of touches. Washington was the guy in on more snaps. And so I think he's one of these potential cheap guys who's shown big playability, is active in the passing game, and kind of fits the mold of a potential GPP flyer this week on the cheap running back side.
Washington was also on the field for that 1-yard touchdown. I think that's worth noting too. They just gave it to the fullback.
Yeah, it was a fullback dive instead. So they had him out there on all the plays that they ran inside the goal line.
Cards, Ryan Matthews at 4.9. He's a guy that's not really staying on the field too much, but the matchup looks good there against Washington. You asked the question, could you answer your own question? Because that's the thing. It's like, it almost feels like you're forcing it. Gio Bernard, if game script goes, the way we think it's going to go, he can catch like 6 or 7 passes, certainly get in the end zone, fall in there. Just the way Cincinnati goes. He's going to be on the field when they're behind, and they're probably going to be behind against New England. You asked the question, do you have an answer? Was it rhetorical?
Yeah, a little bit rhetorical. I don't love a lot of these guys. The Eagles continue to say, "Oh, Ryan Matthews is our guy," and they keep pounding that fist, and the papers keep writing it. But he's only playing on 32 or 33% of the snaps. They've got Darren Sproles out there for 50% of the snaps. They're working Smallwood in there. Like the only way Ryan Matthews saves you is if he gets a goal line touchdown or 2, and it's not a great place to be, because if he doesn't get those goal line touchdowns, you could be staring at 5 fantasy points. He had a negative fantasy point game against the Steelers. So, I guess that was the game he got hurt, but it's super hard to trust him because of the snap usage. You've got a split backfield in Atlanta, and they are on the road in Seattle this week, so it's hard to trust, a guy like Tevin Coleman. I've seen a few people talk about Crowell this week. In terms of workload, the safest workload in that range is TJ Yeldon, and nobody ever likes to click that button either.
No.
But it's a decent matchup for him, and he played on 75% of their snaps in the last game, and they're coming off a bye. Again, it's only in play because of the options down here are pretty thin. So maybe in Detroit, if Washington doesn't come back, they're super thin at running back. Maybe you can get a guy there. As far as I know, he's still pretty much a game time decision. But then you're either, you're talking about Zach Zenner or Justin Forsett, who's only available on FanDuel. It's pretty ugly down there this week.
So, yeah, that is interesting. It might just be that Stafford throws the ball 50 times. That might just happen that game. We're not really sure what's going to happen. Do you have a thought on that, Dink, the backfield there in Detroit?
Yeah, so I think Dwayne, if you're taking a GPV flyer on a running back, I think Dwayne Washington will be the guy if active. All the beats seem to suggest that he's expected to be active. I'm expecting a pretty even split between him and Forsett, but Washington was a good pass catcher in college. He is an explosive athlete, and he did handle the goal line work when they had all their backs healthy earlier. So I think there's some upside there, but I really think the upside this week on the Detroit side is on the passing game. I think they're going to use Golden Tate and Anquan Bolden as their running game, essentially with these short passes. The Rams are without their top corner and Tremaine Johnson. So I think it's a really good spot for some of these cheaper Detroit pass catchers that may be perceived as not having a ton of upside because they play pretty close to the line of scrimmage, and Bolden's 112 years old and still going. But I think it's a really good spot on PPR sites for these guys this week. I'm going to have a lot of exposure to the Lions passing game.
Bolden's a tough dude. I remember his face broke in a game and he came back. He's
incredible.
Yeah, but can you? How much is he as far as his price?
3,900 and Tate is 4,400. I think you can do some things in GPPs with either those guys as a piece of fillers or as a stack with Stafford, who's pretty cheap at 6,200. I think, if I remember off the top of my head. But I think it's a high volume passing attack. Normally, they're down their running backs. They're also down Eric Ebron, which is another guy that really should condense the passing work. They're not a roster that has a ton of wide receivers. So when I have gone through our projections on them, you just start funneling market share to Marvin Jones, Golden Tate, Anquan Bolden, because it's hard to see it going elsewhere. Forsett's not a great pass catcher out of the backfield. He's historically one of the least efficient pass catchers at the running back position ever. And Dwayne Washington is a guy that I think is capable in that role, but the limited practice time for a rookie player over the last few weeks with this injury, I think is going to limit his opportunity. So I really see them funneling a lot of the short passing game to Golden Tate and Anquan Bolden this week.
All right, Bolden's 3.9. Tavon Austin is 3.9. Who do you prefer?
I prefer Bolden over Tavon Austin.
Is that GPP as well?
That's tougher because Austin does have those random 2-touchdown games in him. I think in GPP, I'd prefer Tavon Austin.
Cards?
Yeah, I agree. I'd go the safe route in cash games, but Austin and GPP.
Do you guys have a contingency plan in place here with the Packers? If look, Starks has been ruled out, which by the way kind of flip-flopped. Over in the week, it looked like Starks might get a whole bunch of action with Eddie Lacy dinged. He's still questionable. Well, if he plays, is that backfield entirely his? Is he somebody we're kind of ignoring and maybe we should consider because he's probably going to get 90% of the touches? And if he doesn't play, I don't think the guy's even listed on DK. There's a dude in the practice squad, like Jackson or so.
Yeah, Don Jackson. So they did not promote him, though, today, and they made a bunch of moves on their roster. And I think that signifies that Eddie Lacy is likely healthy and likely going to get the bulk of the carries. In my opinion, it signifies that they have a lot of confidence in his ankle, which has been kind of a question mark all week. So
how about his belly?
When you start projecting out the touches, though, it's hard to get away from giving Lacy a huge market share. And as a result, he starts to look like a decent play, against the Dallas defense that basically survives on opponents not having a lot of plays. Game should play very slow because Green Bay also has tended to play slower this year. So there's not a ton of upside in number of plays, but you're going to get almost all of the market share with Eddie Lacy. So I'm now considering him a viable tournament option, of course, at the very, very deep running back position.
On the other side, how do you handle this, Dick? I talked to Cards about this the other day on Sirius. I'm curious to get your thoughts. So Green Bay, their rush defense, DVOA, I believe it's second. But if you look at the opponents they faced this year, Minnesota, Jacksonville, the Giants, and it's off the top of the head. I can't remember who it was. It's terrible. Whatever it was just a collection of awful, awful options. So do we know that Green Bay's rush defense is good? And if we don't really know, we know what we know here is that we know Elliott's been really, really good. We know Dallas is one of the best O-lines in all football, if not the best. I guess Atlanta might have a conversation there. But Ezekiel Elliott's another guy who's going to be completely ignored despite the fact he's been amazing because, all the other guys. Is he worth is he popping up in your GPP lineups?
He's not for me this week. I do see the reasoning, and I like the fact that Lance Dunbar has been missing time in practice again this week, because with Dunbar off the field, that gives Ezekiel Elliott some potential upside in floor in the receiving game. We saw him catch 3 passes last week. That's something he was very good at doing at Ohio State, but just hasn't been asked to do that in Dallas because Dunbar is effectively their receiving back on those kind of 3rd and long situations. So those extra snaps help the floor, they help the ceiling. But for me, I'm still trying to keep my running back pool relatively tight, and he just doesn't happen to make the cut. I'm trying to keep it down to like 6-7 running backs that I'm using and mixing in all my lineups, and he's just sort of outside on the periphery.
Who's the guy you're most afraid of not having enough shares of as of right now?
Well, it's not going to be Le'Veon Bell because I will make sure to have enough shares of him, but that would scare the heck out of me if I was underweight Le'Veon Bell this week. But I would say DeMarco, just the way the pricing works out, I'm a little bit. It's just harder to fit him in alongside some of the other options I want, and he's probably the guy I'm most scared of not having enough of when my lineups are finalized.
Can you give us some extra insight on Jordan Howard and the Bears? He's perfectly fine at 6'2", right?
Yeah, I think he's a cash game option. I think he's one of these guys that, he's a workhorse. He played over 90% of the snaps last week. He's getting targets in the passing game. Jacksonville's vulnerable against the run. The Bears are another team. There's so many teams this week that aren't traditionally strong offenses that get high implied team totals. And the Bears, not that they have a high implied team total, but they're pushing 23, 24 points. That's unusual for them. Tennessee and Buffalo being the primary other two that many have talked about this week. But I think Jordan Howard's just his security and touches and role in the Bears offense makes him a cash game viable option.
Cards, who's the guy that you're kind of scared you don't have enough shares of?
Yeah, it probably is Murray on those running backs. He's definitely the one on the high end that I don't have a lot of right now. Don't really have much Lamar Miller either. Interesting on Howard. It'd be nice if they'd run the football a little bit more. They weren't down more than 6 or 7 points against the Colts last week, and they just let. Not that Hoyer was inefficient, threw for almost 400 yards, but it seems like they just went away from the run at times. And Howard's been so good, but. I've got quite a bit of him as far as those mid-range running backs go. I think he has a good day. So, to touch on that Green Bay game real quick, with Eddie Lacy basically being the only healthy running back there, this could be one of those games where Green Bay gives Randall Cobb 5 or 6 carries out of the backfield. They did that last year towards the end of the season in the playoffs. They'd line him up in the Wildcat or line him up in the backfield and give him 5 or 6 carries. I wouldn't rule out them doing that maybe for a series to spell Lacy a little bit this week. And obviously that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get tons of production there, but every touch helps. And they've taken Cobb off the injury report, so he's fine. He had his first big game last week. So don't sleep on him maybe as a mid-range wide receiver option.
And take your call. This is Golden Tate week.
I think so. I'm going to have a lot of Golden Tate. And the great thing about Golden Tate right now is there's so many things working in his favor and people hate him so much.
Yeah.
And that works in ownership's favor. Like nobody wants to play Golden Tate, and that's cool by me. Like they've just lost 2 guys that if they're normally healthy, their whole offense, Theo Riddick and Eric Ebron, normally are going to combine for somewhere around 30 to 35% of the targets. They just lost 30 to 35% of the targets, and where are they going to go? So I'm going to take my chances a lot on this Detroit passing game in GPPs this week.
And the A-dot doesn't concern you?
No, for a site like DraftKings, it really doesn't, because you can have a good GPP day without racking up yards. If you go like 8 for 80 with a touchdown in your 4,400, that's a fine GPP day. And that can be, 10 yards per catch. He could even go, 9 or 10 for 60 or 70 if he's used kind of out of the backfield in that Theo Riddick role, which I think he will be. And I think you can pay off on DraftKings. It's a little bit harder to do on FanDuel, admittedly, where you need touchdowns, you need the yards to kind of pile up the points.
We're currently running in the forums, I believe. When will a Golden Tate crack 10 points? I think this is the week, right?
Yeah, I feel good about 10 points this week.
All right, let's dig back in the mailbag. Let's talk to, I don't know how to pronounce this, ALBRECHP, just a bunch of letters. I've heard a lot of mixed responses as far as the Chicago wide receiver matchups with regards to Jacksonville defenders. If possible, can you clear up the defensive matchups for Alshon, Meredith, and Eddie Royal, who's in the slot? What percentage? Now, I feel like a hypocrite now, because before I was lecturing the chat, I was saying, don't give us specific questions. This is a very, very specific question. But I think it just sort of opens up the question of, Cards, how much do you study those quarterback, wide receiver matchups? How much do you think that they're legit? We hear even the talk of Hopkins is not going to get shouted this week. Do we believe that? Is that something you dig into? Like who's in the slot, who's not in the slot? And how much do you lean on the PFF matchup chart, basically? Yeah,
I think you can look at it to some extent. I'm not the person that'll dig in with the cornerback that's ranked 60th versus a mid-range wide receiver or something like that. But the higher end guys, wide receivers and cornerbacks, you can certainly look at. And I think the Bears passing game might be a little bit of a trap this week, simply because I think a lot of people are going to play Hoyer on the high end. He's thrown for 300 yards in 3 straight games, or on the low end, rather. He's thrown for 300 yards in 3 straight games. And, everyone had the big day with Cam Meredith last week. But Jacksonville's corners with Jalen Ramsey and Mukamara, who's back, they're pretty good corners. Now, House hasn't been good, but he came up on the injury report this week, so they don't even know if he's going to, get a full complement of snaps. I forget their other corner that's back this week, but it's just I'm a little bit skeptical with the Bears passing game this week. If there's the best matchup of the bunch is probably Royal with a lot of snaps in the slot, but I don't know. Obviously, Drew is a little bit more plugged in with the Bears, but I think based on the way that you can normally beat Jacksonville's defense, this is a part of the reason why I have a lot of Jordan Howard this week, and I think the Bears would be wise to give him 20, 25 carries if they stay competitive in this game, which they should at home. So I'm probably underweight a bit on Cam Meredith compared to where the field's going to be this week.
Yeah, one of the things, you hear, one of the buzzwords you hear around the industry is funnel defense, and almost always they're talking about good run defense versus, bad pass defense. Jackson was a funnel defense, but the other way. They're much better as far as DVOA in the secondary, and they're really vulnerable to the run. So that speaks to what you're suggesting as far as how we're getting a bunch of runs. If you can talk about the Chicago situation as far as this week and just in general, how do you handle, quarterback wide receiver matchups? Do you, how much weight do you put in it basically on a week-to-week basis?
Yeah, so just to give an indication of how the Bears wide receivers typically line up, it's almost always Alshon Jeffrey on the left, Eddie Royal in the slot, and it was Kevin White. Now it's Cam Meredith on the right side. And, Adam Levitan has joked that, Brian Hoyer might be like George Costanza, that he can't go left because he keeps throwing right no matter who's over there. But that's generally how they line up. Royals played about 72% of his snaps in the slot, and that is the most favorable matchup. In terms of using the matchups, I don't use them a ton. We had some good research done on our site with a strategy article by Colin Drew talking about how different the PFF cornerback wide receiver ratings have on impacts on fantasy points. And basically, it doesn't have a ton of impact until you get to the really big mismatches, the very high-end wide receivers against some of the worst corners. Those guys tend to have exceptional floors and really crazy high ceilings. But for the most part, there's not a huge difference between like the bottom 20th percentile and the bottom 40th percentile in terms of the cornerbacks. And I think people get a little bit too lost in the nuances of these small differences in rankings, which are already from an inherently small sample size, because that's just the way football works. So I pay attention to them a little bit. If I see a giant mismatch, it's something I might weight a little bit more heavily, but it's not something that I pay a ton of attention to in terms of trying to separate, as Card said, like the 60th ranked cornerback versus the 62nd ranked cornerback, and trying to pick out matchups like that.
Thoughts on fading Meredith in tournaments this week?
I'm in favor of fade on Meredith. I love him in cash games. He's projected as a very, very good value on both sites in cash games. But I agree with Cards. I think there's more upside to. I think the ownership's going to get crazy. I think it's going to be like 30 to 40% in some of these GPPs, and as a result, I think at that point the risk reward starts to swing in your favor. And I think Jordan Howard is a tremendous leverage play on that ownership as well. So I agreed with Justin in that perspective. So I'm debating whether I'm going to full fade Cam Meredith in GPPs. I'm definitely going to be underweight, but I've been toying with a full fade all weekend, and we'll see where I land on that. But for sure, I will be underweight.
Who are your pivots right now as far as the guys that are moving off of Meredith? Move off Meredith and potentially onto who?
Yeah, well, Golden Tate.
More Golden Tate, yeah.
One of them for me. I think there's a number. I think Michael Thomas on both sites is priced right around. I think he's a decent pivot. On DraftKings, I think Kenny Britt is an interesting pivot at 3,700. He's been pretty effective this year when he's been given the opportunity. And the Lions defense is just all sorts of bad. They're bad against the run. They're bad against the pass. They're still missing DeAndre Levy. Ziggy Ansah is still questionable. So they've been kind of a banged up defense. So I think there's some pivots around there. Golden Tate is the one that I will have the most exposure to, though.
Can I throw one more both your way? I'm not fully committed to this. I just think it's interesting because the price. He's the Stone minimum. You mentioned Levitan. I could say Stone.
Yeah.
Eli Rogers at 3K? Is that nuts?
Dean, did you see right before the show that Pittsburgh sent out an injury update that Sammy Coates is probably not going to play?
Yeah.
And I think that changes a lot of things because, Antonio Brown is 10K. Wheaton is out, and Sammy Coates is probably out, and nobody wants to play Darius Hayward-Bay. So
no,
I don't think Eli Rogers is crazy at all.
Can I play him in cash, Ding? Because that'll make things so much easier for me.
I think you can with Wheaton and Coates. If Coates is officially ruled out, I think you definitely can, because you got to figure he's going to play. He practiced in full all week, returning from the injury issue that he's had. You got to figure he's going to be in there on 2 wide receiver sets, so he's going to probably play close to 90+% of the snaps. And that's a very potent offense. It's a very good matchup against Miami. It's a homecoming game for him of sorts. I know you love the narratives. So it's you got that in your favor as well. And
I'm sorry, homecoming game for Rodgers or Antonio Brown?
For Eli Rogers.
Okay, I know it's for Brown as well. Brown's from Miami.
Yeah, so Eli Rogers was talking about the same thing about wanting to be able to play in front of friends and family and stuff like that.
All in on Rodgers. There it is.
So I think at 3K this week in particular, you need salary relief wide receivers. 3K helps a lot. It goes a long way. So I definitely think he's in play in cash.
How about yourself, Cards? What are your thoughts on Rodgers? I think I'm very much intrigued.
Yeah, definitely if Coates is out. I mean, I think that makes it really safe. And like Drew said, the 3K price tag just it opens up a lot for you. So, and what the crazy thing on DraftKings is you can basically play Le'Veon Bell and Eli Rogers together for the same price as Antonio Brown. It's Antonio Brown's that expensive. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that I'll be doing, especially if we get confirmation that Coates is out.
You guys mentioned Antonio Brown. Are you paying up for him in tournaments? Or to what extent, I guess, if so?
With the Coates news, I'm going to have more than I had initially planned on. The challenge with that price tag is you really need a crazy big game. You need, like, on DraftKings, you probably need high 30s to make it worthwhile. He can definitely do it. If anybody can do it, it's Antonio Brown, and it's a great matchup for him. But with this wide receiver core just decimated, I'm going to have more of him than I originally anticipated coming into this week.
How about yourself, Cards?
Yeah, same. I haven't finalized a ton yet, but I'll probably end up having him more than I thought I would.
All right, we're going to get out of here in 5 minutes or so. A couple more questions to dig out of the mailbag. How concerned are we with the weather in Oakland and Seattle for passing games? This is from Fuego Steve. We just talked to Fuego Steve on Sirius, so we're getting him on all different platforms. Thanks for joining the show. Dick, we don't normally concern ourselves with rain, just unless it's really, really hard rain. It's wind that's a concern. I have some Cooper shares on FanDuel right now locked in on Thursday. I feel like they're going to turn into Marvin Jones shares. I think that's kind of my plan right now. I don't necessarily panic over weather, but it seems like, of course, we yelled to Kevin Roth on Sunday morning. So chief meteorologist here at RotoGrinders, so let us know what's going on. But I'm a little bit concerned with the weather. How about yourself?
Yeah, I think Vegas is also telling us they're a little bit concerned as well. The totals dipped down 1.5 points since open. And the interesting thing is it's been largely on the Oakland side, which when you think about it, which of these two teams relies more on throwing the ball, and which of these two teams relies more on throwing the ball down the field? Well, that's Oakland. Kansas City, when they're throwing the ball, it's generally within a 7 to 8 yard stretch from the line of scrimmage. It's usually the short, kind of controlled West Coast passing game. And so I don't think it's as big of a deal for the Kansas City side, which if you feel like people are reacting against Alex Smith or Jeremy Maclin or Travis Kelce based on this, I think that might be an opportunity to get them at lower ownership. But I do think the Oakland side might be a little bit more susceptible to wind because they tend to have the receivers running more routes down the field.
Cards?
The Browns just released Charlie Whitehurst if Oakland is looking for a guy to maybe throw a few checkdown passes there this week. Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern. I know that weather system's been moving through kind of California the last couple of days, and it just keeps kind of rotating around there. It's affected the golf tournament out in California. So it's windy out there, and that's the primary concern. It sounds like the afternoon hours tomorrow might not be as bad as they were originally expecting. So it is something to monitor into the morning and kind of see, what the weather impacts are, because we saw it in Baltimore last week. The passing games were really affected there, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
I saw a friend of the show, Al Smizzle, talked about, I think on his podcast, he liked Chris Conley this week. He's 3.1K. Alex Smith, as is a guy who really can't throw the ball downfield. Now if there's 40-mile-per-hour winds or gusts or something like that, is Conley off your radar if these winds sustain, Drew?
Yeah, he was a guy that I thought was a really sneaky recommendation from Al when he made that at 3.1K, because he's playing tons of snaps. He's a really good, gifted physical receiver and has the ability to work down the field. But certainly, I think things are just going to be tightened up. I think there's going to be more run plays. I think they're going to run stuff closer to the line of scrimmage. So I think I'm more likely to have less of Chris Conley than when I kind of came into this week.
Getting out of here in just 2 minutes or so. One last question for the mailbag, Dink. We're going to let you watch the Cub game in a second. This is from Dean78904. I said the questions are bad, so I had to find a new one. Not really sure where he's from.
Are you going to send yourself a shirt?
I know a guy. Have you allowed yourself the prospect of thinking about a Cubs World Series? And if so, have you made any promises? What will you do? What are you willing to give up? Have you gone that far yet in your head?
No, I haven't gotten to the negotiating standpoint of the 5 stages of grief quite yet. I've allowed myself to think. It's hard for me. As a data guy, I feel like they've done everything that they can do to put themselves in the best position possible. And so I feel in some ways like this is really the year that they deserve it. And they haven't had very many years at all where they've deserved anything. So I'm a little bit anxious and a little bit nervous because I feel like they deserve it so much. But I haven't really let myself think about, people have asked me, do you intend on going to a World Series game or different things like that? How much would you pay to do it? And I just haven't gotten there. They've got this series with the Dodgers to worry about. And so every game is kind of, for me, I'm in cliche mode over here as a fan. I'm taking everything one game at a time.
We're stepping aside in just a second, so I'm going to resist going on a Theo Epstein is overrated rant. Cards, do you want to throw some water on this? You want to make any bold proclamations and say the Cubs are not going to win the World Series?
No, they're already ahead, so it's probably going to be tough for anybody to knock them off. But, the Dodgers haven't beaten a left-handed pitcher since 1992, so they'll win Bruins there with Leicester. And look, they've built the team the right way, and they deserve to get one. And if it doesn't happen this year, I'm sure it'll happen in the next few. I mean, they've got a pretty dynamic team top to bottom, and they're pretty young. So no hate on the Cubs from me.
All righty. Well, we'll check out Twitter later. I feel like that might change at some point. But
no, just my neighbors.
Thanks for watching the NFL DFS Mailbag show here with Roto Grinders and Daily Roto. Thank you, Dink. Thank you, Cards. Enjoy your football weekend. We're out of here. Holler.